When it comes to sequels, Pixar has always shown that they are better at Disney at producing them. Not that they produce great quality films constantly, as I have had my many problems with some of them, but how they still manage to make a good story overall with each new film, especially in the case of the Toy Story franchise. Because from Toy Story 2 onward, these films have remained to be classics for many families throughout the years, becoming the most beloved franchise for the studio and the most recognizable in all of Disney to date. Without it, the realm of 3D animation wouldn't be here where it is today, and that is something to actually be appreciated. But when it comes to continuing such a franchise comes the fact that they diluted and ruined the story they previously had when there is nowhere else to go for it, a problem being presented in Toy Story 5 that has been announced. This is a problem I've had since Toy Story 4 ever came out, where I don't hate the film at all and think it's a fantastic movie with a heartwarming story, but when I consider it with the entire story as the franchise as a whole at this point, it really becomes a terrible movie and destroys what we once had in the franchise and as a sequel. How characters like Bonnie and Woody actually at the end forget everything they learned in the last movie, were how that third film of the franchise really concluded the story brilliantly to move the studio in a new era. Because when you do something like that with a newer film, with a character like Andy who has been there from the very beginning, then it becomes hard to justify the franchise's continued existence. Well, theatrically speaking that is. Shorts and other merchandise in theme parks are fine, but expanding that beyond that point with what has been satisfied in the story is no way to actually handle a property. This is something we clearly saw with what Lightyear brought, where although most of us know it isn't a Toy Story films, it uses the brand in a way to create new films for the sake of making easy money. It's something that doesn't allow filmmakers the chance to create their own new stories or execute them properly because it's under a heavy executive hand and ultimately sets up newer films for failure after releasing the last few movies on Disney Plus, affecting the slow start that other films like Elemental had that succeeded later on because people saw it was a good movie, offering more than what Disney was willing to show for it. And because of those failures like Lightyear itself, it instead encouraged those like Bob Iger to announce more sequels as newer projects for Disney, like Toy Story 5 itself, that the company has put itself into a dark position that they need to go back to what worked, like the franchises they have, to put Pixar back on the map in theaters after what they themselves actually did that actually damaged the brand image. But the problem that remains in this situation is the fact that Toy Story 5 can't work, where after what happened in the fourth, it sent Woody off again and rehashed an emotional ending from the third, but for the toys and Woody this time. I mean, this isn't to say that it won't 100% work at all, because if anything is to go by with what Toy Story 4 had, even though its issues story-wise with its reception, then it still can actually find an emotional story with it. This is where most people actually say the theory of having Andy grown up with kids would actually circle back the story perfectly, and that could actually probably work, but it still just doesn't feel necessary. How even at this point, there is just no reason for me to continue because I've already moved on, like what Andy did with his toys in the 3 that actually satisfied everyone. The people who actually watched the first and watched them over the years with the sequels actually found themselves in Andy's position and were gladly able to move on with what they actually provided in a new era in their own life. After all, none of the actors are getting any younger here, and some have actually passed on at this point. The people who are the heart of the movie that worked so well are no longer there. Sure, you might reduce some of the roles and hire new voice actors here and there, as it is an animated movie, but the feeling you had along with them is hardly there anymore because they're gone. And besides that point, most of these Toy Story films actually focus on Woody getting lost from the other toys and then coming back after learning an important lesson about valuing your owner and being there for them as they grow up in the world. Just doing the same thing over again in a different light that actually worked. But it's not right to actually do that again for your story, because in order to do that, you need to take away something from the characters like Toy Story 4 did to actually succeed. The only reason that that story mainly worked is because they made Bonnie actually break her promise to Woody and her own character development for how she actually loved him in the first place, where when they actually made her do that, it allowed the story to actually go where they needed to go, where it wouldn't actually happen had they kept her character intact from the third film. It proves the fact that you don't have anything else to offer or say because it hinges on those ideas about being there for your kid until you grow up. Otherwise, you'd be bored because there isn't anything else for them to actually do. You just can't keep expecting to ride on the goodwill of what you had because it already disallows you moving forward to the future, where when Walt Disney was actually running Disney, he never looked back on what he had in animation to actually pour it again, and just kept moving forward to the future with newer projects to what he could tell and actually create, compared to those who are actually running Disney now, who run Disney and Pixar to rely on their past like Frozen again and Toy Story to continue that success. Because after all, both of those films actually made $1 billion in the same year, clearly showing how beloved they are in the brand name and guaranteed success. But throwing at it constantly, and what most people have actually now picked up upon in 2023, the more you try to do something you did before or dilute it, the more quickly people are are able to turn their backs on it because they already know what generic mediocre crap you are already serving. Because in the age of streaming, most people have actually become much more smarter as to what to expect in terms of movie content, recognizing how some properties are just more valuable watching at home rather than on the big screen, and how you really need to find a compelling reason instead to why people need to watch them in the first place, especially in theaters. Or if you announce things without regard for other stories that you did before, then you do ultimately drop in quality, looking at films like Indiana Jones. And because this year for theaters and the box office has been wild with various movies that you wouldn't expect become breakout hits, I find myself personally thinking that the next Toy Story movie might not even actually break into $1 billion either. Because at this point, Disney has actually damaged the brand so far from what it once was that many have actually turned their backs and rejected them completely. Well, not probably completely, but people, because of COVID and the rise of streaming, as I mentioned earlier, feel less inclined to actually support something we've already been satisfied with this end result. Where certainly the discussion actually surrounding Toy Story itself has been overall negative with what we've already experienced, that we've already had enough and we don't need to actually have more. Where for a company that does talk a lot about its audience and appeasing that, it certainly doesn't actually listen to it by how many remakes and sequels that they are willing to produce. That they're just continuing to dilute this without any regards to what is actually happening overall, especially with what happened in their live action films recently. But by all means, this isn't to say that it won't make the money it had, because it certainly can, where it's just more of a matter of how much that will actually pay off or eventually encourage more dreadful sequels beyond what we have. That unless you design a world that allows for many sequels, then you really have no reason to do it at all unless you become so idealist and soulless to what you actually are, or were in this case. It's like they always say, if you love something, then you must let it go, and it's actually best to do that in the case of the Toy Story franchises, where you can keep it on a high note and don't even attempt to continue it, where if you actually do, something bad would actually bound to happen. Something I'm sure Disney does not want to do after the middle reception of the sequel trilogy and the MCU at this moment. But nevertheless, I still have no doubt in Pixar's ability to create stories despite what has happened, because overall, these decisions are the ones mainly driven by Disney instead, where it devolves into a major executive problem with all they're able to produce. I mean, yes, these studios will create new stories as they would allow, but the overall problem is how they allow more merchandising and brands up in front first for the consumer experience rather than the value of what one specific story that could be told. Like I've always said, sequels aren't necessarily a bad thing if you know what you're doing, but in this case, when you are doing something that already finished well and didn't have a plan to continue, then you're virtually doing nothing but constantly eroding the trust in that very consumer instead into something very bland. A statement that many can actually make in Disney's own theme parks with what has actually happened recently. I mean, Toy Story characters have become a major component of that section in the business, and it's something that's also hard to ignore at that point. But it's more about what I should feel when I constantly see it again and again. Why should I mostly invest myself in the story when I already had the opportunity to see it about 4 times at this point? It's where you actually question if any of these executives that announce these new projects moving forward for the various studios ever even watch the movies that they're actually producing and see the underlying problems that they themselves cause. Because that certainly doesn't seem like the very case now with what movies have been announced and continue to be announced. But beyond that again is where we also have to realize how they ended Woody's story in the 4th with him going to Bo Peep in the end. Once again bringing up how each film actually had him go on in his own lessons. The lessons they tried to actually finally finish in this film by having him off doing his own thing beyond ruining other characters. How after everything, his journey was complete with Andy and with Bonnie at this point, and now he could do his own thing to help other toys. And with the main character satisfied in his journey, what is the point of him actually returning for? What story is there to tell beyond him helping other toys actually finding a home, or just reuniting with Andy in some form? These are questions that need to be answered on their part that aren't easily solvable again with what I just added. Sure, you can focus on these other subset of toys, but that impact wouldn't be the same without the main characters actually driving the story forward at this point. I mean, if they can, and I know they actually can to some extent, then hats off to them. But I guess it's just the fact that we're all tired of this point, and tired of seeing the same generic formula that has been passed down year after year, yearning for the opportunity to actually see something new. How we just don't need any more Toy Story films because we're just done with it at this point. We are all done, we have been satisfied by what has been done, and we just want to move on. And of course, to close out, I just wanted to make this video to address some legit concerns about what has happened and what is going to happen for Disney and Pixar's relationship with what we have learned so far. That decisions like these are really bad. especially for the fact it was announced during Disney's Q1 earnings call when the company laid off more than 7,000 jobs just to save $5 billion, which really does not look good on their part, where the strategy is more of the same instead of any innovation, where that is actually disappointing to see. Where the only hope we have now is actually rested in newer films like how Leo could actually turn out for Pixar before they would dive right back into more sequels. And then again, management has done a great job at mismanaging everything with Disney, where that hope I have will soon diminish. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.